I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 136 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. To all members, please wait until I recognize you by name prior to speaking. And I'd also like to remind everyone that all comments should be addressed through that of the chair. Okay, we don't have translation, so I'm going to continue to speak. Okay, you don't have the good mic. Okay, I'm going to say thank you for your cooperation. I hope everyone has their mic working. Merci à tous pour votre coopération. Tout va bien.
I'd like to thank everybody for their cooperation.
And the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024. The committee will commence its study of hate-motivated violence targeting the 2S LGBTQI+ community. At this point, I would like to welcome our witnesses. Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Peter Madu, Assistant Deputy Minister, Operational Intelligence and Assessment Requirements. From Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre, Michael Wallace, Executive Director. From the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Catherine Dubuc, Acting Director General, Hate Crimes, Culture, Innovation, and GBA+. We will now begin with our opening statements. I would welcome Ms. Madu. You have the floor for approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Madu. Pardon.
Thank you, Chair. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du comité, bonjour, je m'appelle...
Ladies and gentlemen, Chair and members of the committee, my name is Peter Adu, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of Operational Intelligence and Assessment Requirements at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service.
CSIS to appear on this very important issue. CSIS takes all threats of violence very seriously and continues to monitor, investigate, and mitigate threats against the 2S LGBTQA+ community in Canada on a priority basis. L'extrémisme violent constitue toujours une menace grandissante et importante.
Violent extremism continues to pose a significant and growing threat to Canada's national security. While only a small number of Canadians are actually willing to engage in serious violence in support of their gender and identity-driven views, their actions continue to have devastating real-world consequences, as we saw in Waterloo just last year.
Extremist activity is felt acutely within the 2S LGBTQIA+ and other marginalized communities, as they can be the target of threats emanating from both ideological and religiously motivated violent extremists. The anti-gender movement, which rejects the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, is a national security issue when associated with extremists who exercise gender identity-driven violence as a result of personal beliefs stemming from misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, religious interpretations, conspiracy theories, or a generalized fear of social-cultural change. Il importe de signaler que même si les discours violents ne...
It is important to note that while violent rhetoric itself does not equate to or necessarily lead to violence, the ecosystem of violent rhetoric within the anti-gender movement, compounded with other extreme worldviews, can lead to serious violence.
Gender extremist rhetoric could inspire and encourage serious violence against the 2S LGBTQIA+ community and its allies. Violent actors may also be inspired by real-world events, like the University of Waterloo attack, to carry out their own extremist violence, sometimes with little to no warning. Anti-2S LGBTQIA+ rhetoric is also spreading widely through social media and online forums among violent extremists, increasing the risk of extremist violence against the community and its allies, as well as the risk of vulnerable youth being radicalized online platforms. To counter these threats and protect public safety, CSIS continues to vigorously investigate and disrupt the threat activities of violent extremists in collaboration with foreign and domestic security intelligence and law enforcement partners. Where appropriate, CSIS leverages the full extent of its authorities to mitigate threats of gender identity-driven violence. Le SCRS est aussi déterminé à renforcer la résilience et à mieux sensibiliser le...
CSIS is also committed to building resilience and increasing public awareness of these threats, including through modernized authorities granted to CSIS under Bill C-70 an act respecting countering foreign interference. CSIS's new Resiliency Disclosure Authority recognizes that protecting Canada's national security is a shared endeavor that includes partnering with all levels of government, Canadian communities, and the private sector. CSIS is actively using this new tool and is committed in its efforts to bridge across sectors and find ways to cooperate in the national interest. This includes increased sharing of relevant threat information to a wider range of recipients to protect national security.
Canada feel safe to express themselves and their identities without threats of violence. Canadians must work together to prevent radicalization at its root by combating mis and disinformation, slowing the spread of violent content and hateful rhetoric, and fostering cohesion between Canadian communities. I will conclude by noting that while CSIS cannot publicly comment on its operational activities or ongoing investigations, I welcome this opportunity for a frank and transparent discussion on the threats to Canada's two LGBTQIA+ communities, as well as happy to answer your questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madu. At this point, I would like to welcome Mr. Wallace. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente et membres du comité. Je vous remercie.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak today on this important topic as we approach the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women.
Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, I am responsible for assessing and advising the government on the threat of violent extremism to Canada and to Canadian interests abroad. This includes recommending the national terrorism threat level. As the leader of a national fusion cell, I am accountable to the National Security Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister and to the Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. ITAC produces all source assessments to predict the likelihood of a violent extremist attack. To reach a spectrum of clients, ITAC publishes at multiple levels of classification. In this way, we seek to inform many stakeholders and police postures as well as their dialogue with communities. The ITAC paper that is in this committee's view and report is a threat assessment on 2024 Pride events. In preparing that document, analysts evaluated the complex interplay between threat actor intentions, capabilities, and opportunities to carry out violence. The Center forecasted a period of heightened propaganda during Pride season, and it reinforced the possibility of a lone attacker. Then, as now, the most likely scenario facing Canada is an individual motivated by a personalized world view, and inside this view there can be contradictory grievances, and this person would use unsophisticated weapons. Every day, ITAC personnel evaluate potential violence against those who advocate for sexual equality, diversity, and equal opportunities. That is because, to be clear, women and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community are constantly cited in violent extremist rhetoric and have been the target of specific violence in recent years. Both the ideologically motivated violent extremist and the religiously motivated violent extremist seeks to victimize women and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Voici deux exemples récents qui illustrent bien la situation.
These two recent examples punctuate the point. In 2023, a former student of the University of Waterloo went on a stamping rampage in a gender studies class in order to instill fear. That same year, 2023, Calgary police disrupted a foursome supporting the Islamic State. An underage male in that group wanted to kill a woman and made threats against Pride.
26% of ITAC's outputs addressed real or potential threats to individuals based on identity factors, such as gender or sexual orientation. This category of violent extremist mentality is rooted, to be sure, in homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Our IMV-related publications have increased each year over the past few years, and IMV is a global phenomenon, so ITAC also, unfortunately, provides products of this sort from allied agencies around the world. Western democracies have acknowledged how social media have contributed to the mainstreaming of violence. Our societies are increasingly polarized. The impact of rhetoric on Canadians' perception of safety and security cannot be underestimated, even if the average number of terrorist attacks in Canada has remained at 1.8 attacks per year for the last 5 years. This causes me to acknowledge an important point, and that is that the vast majority of hateful messages and actions fall below the threshold of national security. Nonetheless, my colleagues in national security and I are deeply concerned that anti-gender violent rhetoric could inspire youth or another vulnerable member of our society to mobilize to violence. National security stakeholders, ITAC included, are using all of the tools at their disposal to prevent this outcome. For its part, ITAC continues to serve as an early warning for serious violence against women, the 2S LGBTQIA community, public policymakers, and community events. J'espère que mes commentaires ont aidé le comité.
I hope that my comments have advanced the committee's understanding of the issues. It would be my pleasure to answer your questions.
Mr. Wallace. Ms. Dubuque, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. My name is Catherine Dubuque, currently Acting Director General for the Hate Crimes Policy Team, also responsible for Culture, Innovation, and Gender-Based Analysis Plus Directorate within the RCMP's Reform, Accountability, and Culture sector. Thank you for inviting me here today as part of your study of hate-motivated violence against the Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ communities. I'd like to begin by sharing or explaining the mandate and the work of the RCMP, and then sharing some key points on hate crimes in the Canadian context. The RCMP across Canada continues to support the Government of Canada's efforts to combat hate crimes through collaboration with federal and provincial governments and agencies, non-government organizations, communities, and law enforcement partners. Hate crimes are motivated by prejudice or bias against an identifiable group. Under the Criminal Code of Canada, identifiable groups include sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, among many other groups. According to Statistics Canada, police-reported hate crimes targeting sexual orientation have increased 225%, and hate crimes targeting transgender and non-binary individuals have increased 120% between 2019 and 2023. This data encompasses all police of jurisdiction across Canada. The RCMP has experienced similar increases in hate crimes targeting Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ peoples across Canada. It is especially concerning to the RCMP that crimes motivated by hatreds toward these communities are reported to be more violent in nature when compared to all other reported hate crimes. Current data indicates that Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ communities are disproportionately represented in hate crimes targeting gender and sexual orientation. For every crime targeting sexual orientation or sex and gender outside of these communities, there are 28 crimes motivated by hatred against Two-Spirited LGBTQI+ communities. 4 out of the top 5 hate-motivated crime types perpetrated against these communities are violent in nature. Hate crimes targeting the Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ community have increased at a faster rate in 2023 and 2024 than in the previous 3 years. The full extent of the impact of hate crimes on the Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ communities remains difficult to measure. There is a need for more information on the barriers that prevent these individuals from reporting hate crimes, including the fear of escalating violence. Underreporting remains significant, often stemming from the reluctance of victims and witnesses to come forward. The RCMP is aware that Two-Spirit LGBTQI+ communities have historically faced criminalization and persecution by police, noting that many who experience violence did not report it, primarily because they did not think it would make a difference. The RCMP has been committed and continues to be committed to rebuilding trust, fostering engagement, and building community connections. In 2022, the RCMP, in partnership with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, launched the Hate Crimes Task Force to increase the scope, nature, and impact of efforts to address hate crimes in Canada. Progress continues through this forum to increase officer and public awareness of hate crimes and how to report them. On September 24, 2024, the Government of Canada announced Canada's Action Plan on Combating Hate, bringing together new and existing federal initiatives to confront hate in its various forms through three pillars: empowering communities, supporting victims and survivors, and building community trust, partnerships, and institutional readiness. The RCMP is providing national leadership in combating hate crimes through operational policy development, centralized access to relevant data and research, and strengthening partnerships between the RCMP and police of jurisdiction to address hate crimes in Canada. The mandate to investigate hate crimes falls to the local police of jurisdiction. To ensure a coordinated approach to detecting, investigating, and combating hate crimes, the RCMP is supporting these efforts through integrated resources, information sharing, and community partnerships, promoting policies and best practices that are critical to law enforcement's effective response. The RCMP has and continues to strengthen its connections with community groups and organizations working to support victim support services and community-based resources. Hate crimes against the Two-Spirit and LGBTQI+ communities are a significant concern for the RCMP, which is dedicated to the safety and security of all Canadians. Fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui avec vous et de vous répondre à vos questions.
I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight and to answer your questions and to provide you with more information on the projects that are underway at the RCMP.
That impacts the lives, health, and well-being of Two-Spirit and LGBTQI+ people throughout Canada. Merci.
Thank you all for your opening remarks. That does conclude our opening remarks. At this point, we will move to our first round of questioning. Dominique, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup à chacun et chacune de
Thank you to each of you for making yourself available to meet with us today. We're happy to receive you. We've just finished a study on violence against women. So we're kind of in that realm already. We're looking a bit further into things. This time we're looking at a new community, the LGBT community. And now you've pointed this out, that December 6th is a very important date that we cannot forget. What happened at the Polytechnique, where 14 women were killed simply because they were women. And so we will be celebrating 35 years or marking 35 years rather this year. So Ms. Dubuc, you're saying that the victims, and when we hear this quite often, we've heard this quite often rather, that victims have a lot of difficulty trusting police. And you're telling us that we have to restore trust. Now, Quebec went ahead with the plan to rebuild trust, but just in a few words, because we don't have a lot of time, what are you going to do to convince victims to go to the police, to the RCMP, to document their cases, and to lead in a way that leads to arrests? Right. Thank you, Ms. Vien, for the question.
Qu'on entend régulièrement.
So that's information that we hear this often. So some victims are not comfortable. For victims who are not comfortable, we have mechanisms where people can report things anonymously through our website, for example. For those who want to connect with the police, we have a series of programs, community police programs, and we build bridges with the community and governments. So, and with minority groups as well. So the RCMP is very involved in that regard.
Qu'est-ce qu'un crime
What is a crime?
visé justement dans la communauté LGBTQ+, madame?
What's a specific crime that targets the LGBT community? You talked about 4 different types of violent crimes, but what are we talking about? Well, when we're talking about hate crimes, there are 2 things. So there are hate crimes that
Du Canada, où est-ce qu'effectivement
that are covered in the criminal code. So there's an offense committed. So there are 4 specific clauses associated with hate crimes. So anti-Semitism, and that's in the criminal code. And there are also incidents that are more minor in a sense, but I'm not diminishing the importance of those incidents, but incidents that are motivated by hate. So using inappropriate jargon towards or language towards a group.
Combien de cas
Could you tell us how many cases you have per year of these crimes that target the LGBTQ community? Thank you for your question. Well, that's what we're determining that through a working group that we've set up.
c'est difficile de pouvoir rapporter un chiffre.
It's difficult to provide a figure because we know that there are crimes that are not being reported. So what we're doing through the working group that I mentioned earlier, there are 13 police forces that we're working with across the country, including the RCMP and a racial relations organization, a federal organization. We're setting up mechanisms and tools to increase our ability to report rates in a more representative way. Is it more difficult to investigate hate crimes that target the 2S LGBTQI+ community than it would be for people elsewhere in society? No, not necessarily. You know, I mean, it's all relative, of course. We have a partnership with Statistics Canada that presents or that prepares quarterly reports on the question. And so we contribute to a database. We indicate what the underlying motivation is. So, for example, hate. So we can target those in our data. All right, I have just a few seconds left, Mr. Buch, but what are your officers telling you? Why are these people being targeted? Oh, wow, that's a great question. It's for a variety of reasons. There's a lack of understanding of the community. There are policies taken by different government levels. There are exterior or forces in other countries. If you look at what's happening elsewhere than in Canada,
En grosso modo, il y a beaucoup
I would say, you know, there's a lot of miscomprehension or poor comprehension of the group, poor understanding of the group, rather.
6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I want to start focusing on transphobia. In 2021, of the 30.5 million people in Canada aged 15 or older living in a private household, only 0.33% identified as trans or non-binary. It's a minuscule portion of the population, and yet the rhetoric and the misinformation and hate directed at trans people is quite astonishing, actually. And we see it here in Canada, not just in the United States. I mean, in my riding, there were complaints about drag story times at the Oakville Public Library. I don't know that anybody's died at a drag story time, but they certainly have died because of transphobia. And you know, it's not just, you know, far-right YouTube channels that are pushing this. It's, you know, it's Alberta just passed a bill, or 3 bills, I guess, supposedly to protect kids and females in sport. My assistant Rodney dug up a story that happened in British Columbia where during a track meet, a man stepped forward during an event and began questioning the gender of a 9-year-old because she had a pixie cut and demanded that her parents provide documentation to prove her sex. I'm just wondering, do you believe that this kind of transphobic hate also hurts people who the hate is not even directed to? Like, I mean, here's a little girl who's being no doubt traumatized because of the rhetoric that gets into the general discourse. I wonder if you could just talk about the impact that this kind of language and tone impacts on society. Maybe we'll start with you, Ms. Leduc, and then go across.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Thank you, Madam Manoff. This is an example that unfortunately is very heartbreaking to hear, but certainly something that I would say is certainly well known. From the RCMP standpoint, I can certainly won't be commenting personally, but from the RCMP standpoint, what's important to us is obviously in terms of our mandate is ensuring the safety and security of all Canadians. In terms of just my overall observations, I'm sorry, could you please just hone in on the question, please?
Just how this kind of hate impacts other people in the community.
Yeah. Well, I think overall, when we look at, for example, anything that attacks the fabric of our society or certainly the values that we have here purported in Canada in terms of feeling safe and feeling like we can lean on our community members, certainly I would probably purport that really affects the fabric of our society, and that ultimately, you know, what is done to one individual that's harmed impacts all of us as well.
Mr. Badu, did you want to add to that?
Thank you for the question. I think that violent extremism stems from a range of different ideologies that are built on people's fears and hate. From a CSIS perspective, we only intersect when it's acts of serious violence that are motivated by either someone radicalizing another person or inciting to violence. So we don't have a very clear aperture, but we do notice that there is a growing movement of online radicalization that's going on, specifically in the youth, and that's what we can observe from our national security investigation. So a lot of it might just be because they're youthful members of our society that are stuck in an ecosystem online when there's nobody countering the mis or the disinformation that they're getting, and so that just sort of builds towards that hatred.
Dubuque, sorry. We passed Bill C-16, which actually added to the criminal code hate crimes based on gender identity. That was during my first term as an MP, and I'm quite proud of that. You mentioned, you know, how you've been able to lay charges. Has that bill assisted you in being able to lay charges around hate motivated because of gender identity?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, I'm unable to comment on that. I don't have the information available to me. What I can say is that any impact of a bill that's enacted or that's even on the table being proposed at this time, we continue to monitor the impacts in terms of any effects on our policing operations and investigations that are underway.
Do you know if you successfully charged anyone under that, or could you find out for us?
I certainly could in a written submission following the meeting today.
Okay, that would be great. Because, I mean, yeah, no, that would be great. So I only have 45 seconds left. How safe do you think queer spaces are in Canada right now, given the rise of hate? Mr. Wallace?
Yes, I get asked this question a lot. Indeed, the Centre provides a lot of time and attention to this because we are often asked to evaluate special events in communities. And the challenge is that, as my colleagues alluded to, there's just a lot out there. And it's the non-rationality of this hatred. It's the disinformation that could cause someone to believe something that is completely false for even a long period of time. I'd even suggest that the person that would approach that 9-year-old is under a delusion, and that delusion could make them a victim of this echo chamber in the strangest of circumstances. Some of that would propagate the hate could be diluted. But I would say that based on the experience, keeping the finger on the pulse of events that are occurring in this country, we get to a position where we say, if we can, through the RCMP and through the service, keep track of subjects of interest who might have intent and capability and they don't have it, then it comes back to this individual who just is having a really unfortunate day and has been consuming unfortunate material and decides to take action. And when they do take action on that day, it may not even be because of the grievance against that particular community. It could be that they're unstable and they've had a fight with their parent, or they lost a loved one, or they've lost a job, and they're unhinged in this current society.
Thank you. Thank you. MP Larouche, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have so many questions, but I just have 6 minutes. So, and then my colleague will be taking over, so I will try to be as quick as possible. I would like to ask each of you a question. So first of all, Mr. Madou, so you broached the question of religious crimes in your opening statement, and you say, and this is being talked about in Quebec right now. Should Ottawa take action against hate speech? The criminal code protects people who are speaking hatefully if what they're saying is based on religion or good faith or made in good faith. So
loi C-367 du Bloc québécois qui a été déposée. Je ne sais pas si vous avez eu l'occasion de m'en entendre.
So the Bloc actually presented a bill, tabled a bill, Bill C-377. But so what can you talk about there?
Oui, c'est difficile de mon point de vue de pouvoir adresser directement votre question, mais
it's difficult to answer your question directly because I think that what we see through our investigations and our analyses is that there is definitely, the hateful rhetoric that's happening online.
La mobilisation vers la violence
accelerates people and pushes people towards violence, especially among youth. That's what we see. In the religious space, what we've seen in the recent years is that unlike in the past, where radicalized groups would be making attacks abroad, these attacks are taking place online now. So that's what I can tell you right now. Okay. Well, Mr. Wallace, very quickly. And you talked about this as well. You both talked about hatred online. So, Mr. Wallace, how is it important to put limits, to say, okay, well, this is at this, beyond this threshold, it becomes a crime. So yes, you have the right to express yourselves, but you can't go past this threshold.
Yes, I believe it's absolutely important. I believe it's critical to address this. And if I've been eloquent today, it's to speak to the ambiguity in this space that has it such that some of these statements and actions might be one or both of criminal or potentially national security, and that ambiguity is entirely problematic. And it is for this reason that I sit as a member of the Counterterrorism and National Security Committee of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. It's so that I can work with my assessments to help the police understand the ambiguity of this so that it can clearly be addressed as either hate or hate with national security considerations.
Beaucoup de misinformation et de désinformation en ligne.
So there's lots of misinformation and disinformation online. So it has to be recognized as a crime, but we don't currently have the right tools to do this. And so this question of the religious acceptance, that's another problem. I'd like to to end with you, Ms. Dubuc. There is an organization that I met recently, the Emergence Foundation in Montreal. It's a health clinic. So they provide health or services to the LGBT community and to women. And they've observed that in the healthcare system, it's not as easy to get suitable support. And there's a loss of trust in the system.
Parfois,
People,
ils m'ont quand même
don't want to betray their professional secret or their.
santé craint
A lot of people are afraid of the healthcare system, are afraid of the justice system. So there's a loss of trust. So what can you add to that in that respect?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Okay, thank you for the question. What I can tell you from the perspective of the RCMP is that through our national working group on hate crimes throughout the country, we're creating tools for our frontline officers and for our investigators, so we can define what hate crime is and to increase our capacity to build trust and to give communities tools and to implement services to make sure that that there are a variety of people working together collaboratively, so that we can increase the number of the amount of reporting that's done on these incidents. So tools for the officers and the public.
l'importance de bien former, d'informer les juges.
I was just going to say that very thing. We have to give them the right tools. So yes, we complete each other, Madame Dubuc. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I'd like to thank all our witnesses for coming today to do what I feel is an urgent study in regards to the rise of anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes in the country. And I want to speak specifically in CSIS in 2023, CSIS released a report, and it stated the ecosystem of violent rhetoric within the anti-gender movement, compounded with other extreme worldviews, can lead to serious violence. And I would argue there's many public figures now, especially with social media. Sorry, it's hard to concentrate. Sorry. There's many public figures now, especially with social media, that I feel are contributing to an increase of violence. I'm going to give you an example. Jordan Peterson, who lost his license to practice as a psychologist, partly inciting much hate, but including transphobic hate. True North, a right-wing extremist, for my opinion, media outlet. Do you feel that these, you don't have to talk about them specifically as people, but that kind of rhetoric is kind of fueling the fire for people that are vulnerable for extremist behavior?
Thank you for your question. Most definitely, I think that violent extremism stems from a range of ideologies that's driven by hate. And so there's been a clear echo chamber of hate and violence online that doesn't always meet a threshold that's criminal or that it intersects with national security, but it most definitely contributes to aggravating people that are more susceptible to be radicalized. And so from a service perspective, what we notice is that specifically in terms of the religiously motivated violent extremism that we investigate, it tends to then go against anti-Semitism or against the anti-2S LGBTQA+ communities when that violence gets exercised. And often I would say that it's a little bit like my colleague referred to. Some of these things are so individual that you don't know when someone's going to mobilize to violence, but when they do, they may just take a target of opportunity, and it would be amongst those communities that are easily vulnerable to be attacked.
And has that violence increased since the pandemic? yes or no? Just because I don't have a lot of time, would you, yes or no?
I would say we have an increase in investigations for sure.
Yeah, around hate crimes perpetrated against the 2S LGBTQ plus community.
We don't investigate hate crimes, but in terms of violent extremists that are espousing these views, we have an increase.
Yeah, so maybe Madame Dubuc? Dubuc? Dubuc.
You got it.
Yes. Yes?
Yes, without a doubt. Part of my opening remarks was indicating that since 2019, there's been a significant rise, and it's certainly a concern that the RCMP has with other police forces across the country.
Okay, so there's as members of Parliament, we have a lot of power and influence. That's the reality of it. We have a huge audience. Amnesty International put out an article, Pierre Poilievre's comments about trans women, a dangerous distraction. And basically what it says, and you don't need to comment about the leader specifically, I'm not asking. I'm just talking about the kind of political rhetoric we're hearing in the House of Commons is my intention. That's coming from very deep worry. Yeah. It said, it's a person named Kohar in the article says, targeting trans women is a dangerous distraction that threatens the lives and rights of the 2S LGBTQIA+ people and diverts attention from real systemic causes of gender-based violence. Politicians serious about ending gender-based violence in Canada must base their policies on facts rather than harmful and divisive rhetoric. We certainly see in Canada, an increase of disinformation in politics. We certainly see a rise of disinformation coming from the States. Maybe I'll ask you, because you haven't had a chance, Mr. Wallace, is the disinformation campaigns that are being perpetrated by political parties would you argue, placing 2S LGBTQIA+ at greater risk for harms?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I spoke earlier about this ambiguity, and the ambiguity requires us as a society to look at things that are acceptable and unacceptable. But I would say in normal times, when society isn't as polarized as it appears to be at present, what is happening is we have voices that are extreme that used to exist in the fringes of the internet. These folks used to meet in areas that were private, but they have mainstreamed their violence. And the truth is the public discourse is now mixed with a whole bunch of violent extremist rhetoric, and it is difficult for some, I would say, more vulnerable members of our society to truly understand what is being said to them and who is, in their view, responsible for their grievances. So I would say the ambiguity and the mainstreaming of violence is the problem in question.
Thank you. Sorry, MP Gazan.
Chair.
I know we all
Really?
do. I know. Heureusement. MP, député Bien, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Député Bien, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Since 2015, hate crimes have been on the increase in a rather alarming way, and violent crimes, generally speaking, have gone up since 50% since 2015. Sexual assaults by a huge amount, murders by 28%. Gun crimes by 116%, and if we're talking about gang murders, 80% increase. Can you tell us what sort of evaluation do you make of this? And are public policies that the government has presently, are they not a little bit too laxist, considering the data I have just given you?
Monsieur Madou.
Mr. Madou, thank you for your question. It's difficult for me to comment specifically on things that have to do with the criminal code because our perspective is especially on hate crimes that are perpetrated in a violent manner. And this is what intersects with national security. But Madame Dubuc, who is still a police woman, can she perhaps talk to us about the quality of the situation? And I'm not the one saying that it's laxist, but it is police forces who are saying so. Well, what can I tell you when it comes to the criminal code? Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Sorry, I forgot to say that. What I can tell you is that there's no definition in the criminal code as to what a hate crime actually is. The definition does not as yet exist. There is a criminal offense that refers to certain elements, for instance, to foster or promote genocide or things like that. So anti-Semitism, of course, public incitement to hatred, to generate that sort of energy within a public space, for instance. So I can speak about that. So these motivations through hate under those 4 clauses under the criminal code. So these exist. So what comes into play when a person, for instance, is arrested and then taken to trial and then has a judgment made against them, is that any motivation for hatred will be considered an aggravating factor when it comes to sentencing. So that can have an incidence on the length of the sentence. Otherwise, I have no other information available on that subject. So, thank you.
Just a couple quick questions. I'll start with this one, I guess. We've heard from, obviously intimate partner violence is a massive problem that we're seeing in the country as well. And a lot of the folks talked about that the offender was out on bail, that there wasn't, consequences in preventing people from committing crime. We had a gentleman in Peterborough that was arrested for homophobic slurs. We have seen an increase in hate crimes, but he was out on bail. And so I guess my question is, do you have any data on how many of these crimes, these targeted crimes to specific groups, are the offenders out on bail?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. I don't have that information available to me today. However, I'm happy to follow up in a written submission following today's meeting.
That would be tremendous. Thank you. Do any of you have any asks from the specific groups asking for stricter bail conditions?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay.
But again, happy to find out.
That's great.
Thank you.
The other question I would love to know is the data around. I mean, I have some hate crime in my own riding. In 2023, Peterborough had the second highest incidence of hate crime by metropolitan area in Canada, with 33.5 per 100,000. In 2015, Peterborough had 7.4 police-related incidents of hate crime. Do you have any data on what we've seen in hate crime in the last? Do you have that data? Has it increased, is my question.
It certainly has increased. This is something I mentioned in terms of my opening remarks. Statistics Canada releases data taken from the Uniform Crime Survey, reporting survey, and it's actually data that's publicly available every quarter that's been released and is actually carried out within their Canadian Centre for Criminal Justice. So, but if you're looking for RCMP-specific data, I could provide further information in a written submission.
Thank you.
Excellent.
And what's
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Michelle.
Well done. MP Surrey, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci aux témoins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madame Dubuc, you mentioned that there isn't a real definition for what a hate crime is in the criminal code, and that Mr. Madu and Mr. Wallace have both said, and I'm asking the question, you've both mentioned that hate crimes that are happening right now, many of them don't meet the threshold when it comes to national security. Can you help us to understand what this actually means? Because we hear the same thing for politicians. They say, oh, they don't meet the threshold when it comes to national security. Can you help to clarify this, well, both of you, either one of you? Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. From the point of view of national security and the act that regulates CSIS, the crime has to be either extreme violence, it might be a different word in French, but it has to also be associated to something that is either a religious or a political ideology. So that has to be the motivation of the crime. It's not somebody who spontaneously commits a crime, but somebody who, for a religious or ideological reason, commits a violent crime. And that is what we can investigate. We are not a police force. We only do national security investigations. But once something becomes criminal, then of course we will share the investigation results with the RCMP, for instance, or we will give them the necessary data so that they can pursue their investigation on their side. Mr. Wallace, do you have, well, today we're carrying out a study about the violence towards 2SL LGBTQ plus communities. Can you explain to us these definitions when it comes to the crimes?
Assessment is a functional component of CSIS. So we don't exist in legislation. We have the CSIS Act to guide us, and it represents the scope. However, we are an integrated center, so you wouldn't be surprised to find out that we have, for example, a complement from the RCMP, and that we work actively, in particular through the CSIS regional offices, to engage police of jurisdiction across the country. And so the assessment function that we undertake in the current threat environment causes us to be as elastic as possible in understanding what is occurring in, to use a term and not to employ jargon, but something that I prefer to call a verge activity. These are activities that are very close to meeting the threshold of the definition of violent extremism and terrorism that my colleague identified, but that understand that there's a bit of a permeable membrane where certain activities can be 1 minute hate and the next minute national security. So to answer the question, we operate from a functional perspective based on the definition, but practically speaking, we are engaged with law enforcement to try and cover this spectrum, in particular because the threat of a lone actor in Canada requires it of us.
Okay. Merci. J'ai une minute. Madame Dubuc, je pourrais pas répondre.
I have 1 minute. So, Madame Dubuc, in your testimony, it wasn't really specifically about our study, actually. There was very little information when it came to the 2SL LGBTQ plus communities. What kind of training are you giving the RCMP officers in order to be able to get better training? And another question is for Mr. Medu. So Madame Gazin talked about policies and the kind of messages that are being given online.
Parce qu'il y a certains pays.
Who's doing interference in Canada? Is it China? Is it Russia? Who are the actors, in your opinion, who are playing a role in Canada to influence online hatred? Thank you for your question, Madam Chair. Well, state actors
terrorisme, donc des actes
are perhaps not influencing directly extreme behaviors. It's rather people who are radicalizers and who are based outside of Canada and partly here and who represent religious groups. So very often things are happening in chat rooms, encrypted chat rooms that we don't have access to. But a lot of things are happening online. And it's not really state actors who are behind this, rather terrorist or groups, little, even very small groups that are behind all of this.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie les témoins d'être présents.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank you for the witnesses for their presence here. It's very important. So you've talked about bullying, intimidation, violence towards the 2SL LGBTQ plus community. And you've also talked about acceptability factors in society. You know that right now in the United States, there's a lot of violence in that community towards that community. Do you feel that this is something that could happen here as well? The question is for all three of you.
Thank you for the question, Madam President. My perception, having access to information on violent extremism as an integrated center, access to various databases, keeping the pulse on the threat of terrorism in this country and to Canadian interests overseas, is that in general, at this moment, the internationalization, the internet-based propagation of violent extremism threat means that it's not necessarily the partner next door. The influences are coming from various corners of the internet and indeed the globe. The truth is there are individuals in Canada that could be in communication with folks in Europe, the United States, Southeast Asia, and that it's that seems to be the driving factor.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say that from a service perspective, what we could say is that these acts that are taking place anywhere, they're kind of borderless, but could aim to inspire people to mobilize towards violence. So if there are individuals that are radicalized but are not quite sure they want to get to violence, an act that takes place, let's say in the United States or anywhere else, could incite them and mobilize them to do so. So that's an incidence we can sometimes see, that a terrorist attack somewhere may inspire others to mobilize to violence more immediately.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. La question, Madame Bérubé.
My question is for Ms. Bérubé. I'd like to come back to that question. I think my colleagues have already answered. I think given how people are motivated today, thanks to social media and obviously the internet, also at the RCMP, we look always towards the outside and we try to see the impact that derives from various political movements, political parties. We try to see what the trends are from one country to another. But our primary concern, of course, is to focus on the security of all Canadians.
Thank you so much. So I'm hearing more about this, okay, a rise of Christo-fascism that's occurring in the United States and in Canada. And there was an article that was written in the Times Colonist, which is a paper from Victoria. And basically it says we are witnessing a rise of Christo-fascism in the U.S. and Canada. It is especially white Christian men finding political identity outside of previously trusted democratic institutions, including public health. Sometimes this identity reveals itself as skepticism, hate for government leaders, and vaccine mandates. The skepticism and hate is becoming increasingly personally, widening to include racialized people, queer folks, and women who suffer threats of violence. Is Christo-fascism starting to infiltrate Canadian politics?
Thank you for your question. I'm not aware of that term yet being used in our parlance, but what I would say is that violent extremism, ideologically driven violent extremism, is very much driven by typically by individuals that are xenophobic, that can be sort of a gender-based identity, have issues with gender-based identities. It's a variety of different things in terms of ideologies that can mobilize people to violence. So this could be a phenomenon, but it hasn't yet hit my radar. I'm not sure if others.
I think I asked that, and I've been very public about this. I think people are just not well since the pandemic. I think we have a real mental health crisis in the country. I think people are suffering and struggling more than ever. And when people are struggling, they're more vulnerable to being kind of usurped by these extremist groups. Do you see a rise of people that are being kind of, I guess, recruited by extremist groups? Maybe you were nodding your head, so I'll let you answer.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. Madam Gazan. The RCMP is aware of this trend, yes. I cannot comment any further in terms of actual data, but certainly if you're looking for further information on this, I'm happy to follow up after today's meeting.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, for the last, for Conservative and Liberal, we'll do 3 minutes each. Okay, Bernard, vous avez la parole pour 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
You have the floor for 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Dubik. To the extent that there is no actual definition of a hate crime in the criminal code, how can then you can accuse people having committed a hate crime? What do you base it on? Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for that question. And Mr. Généreux.
So hate crime is not defined in Canadian law per se, but there's 4 criminal offenses in the criminal code that deal with hateful motivation. So I talked a little bit earlier about willful promotion of anti-Semitism, advocating genocide, public assignment of hatred, and willful promotion of hatred. So what happens is when an individual is accused and ultimately convicted under the criminal code requires the court to consider that the hateful motivation be used as an aggravating factor to address the sentence or the length of the sentence of that individual that's been convicted.
Okay, merci.
Okay.
De 2015 à 2023, la population canadienne...
From 2015 to 2023, the Canadian population increased by almost 6-7 million. It was we went from 35 to 40 million since 2015. Do you know if the proportion of hate crimes and in fact all crimes committed against the LGBTQ community, whether there has been an increase, or is it proportional to the increase in the population? Thank you for that question, and thank you, Mr. Généreux. Essentially what I said in the beginning of my remarks, that it's difficult to measure. We're currently focusing not only at the RCMP as well as all of the police forces across the country are trying to focus on it so that we can measure and report the actual rates and then to report them. Of course, we do have awareness-raising campaigns in place, which enables us and the general public to understand what a hate crime is and all of the issues that are related to it, for example, confidence, etc., to be able to report them. That's yet to be seen. Do I still have time? Do you believe that the current government's policies, it's been in place since 2015, and we've seen an increase in population, so you don't really have any statistics that you could cite, but do you believe that this government's policies have triggered an increase, a rise in hate crimes? Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Généreux for that question. I won't comment on the government of the day's policies, but I can say that we as an RCMP have taken some measures, but that's a very nice touch, by the way. Yes, I think you do make a good team, but there are measures being taken given what we have in light so that we can obtain better data. Thank you for that question.
For
thank you,
5
Madam
minutes.
Chair. Thank you all the witnesses.
Madame Sédou, vous avez 5 minutes.
What's happening here?
There's a ghost.
Mr. Vick, this year RCMP Hate Crimes Report notes that roughly 60% of hate crime incidents are committed by thrill-seeking offenders, usually youth and teenagers. How can education and social programs be restructured to disrupt these pathways among youth? I know you already talked about that. There's to remove the barriers, special events are happening, but what else can we do?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. Thank you very much, Madame Sédou. There's a few things right now. I think the first is with the RCMP and the Canadian Race Relations Foundations, we've put in place a couple of years ago the Hate Crimes Task Force, which I mentioned earlier is foundational to really establishing public awareness. Not only for, of course, members of the public in our communities, but also for the police as well in terms of what constitutes a hate crime and what constitutes a hate incident. I mentioned earlier as well that we're looking at, of course, mobilizing capacity to be able to report and obviously identify those hate crimes and the incidents in question. There's also anti-hate training and anti-racism police training that's happening with the RCMP, within the RCMP and the police of jurisdictions across the country through the Canadian Police College. But I think most importantly, coming back to your question, is really focusing on our efforts on culturally sensitive and trauma-informed engagement with victims and members of the community and survivors, of course, and witnesses alike.
Thank you. My colleague said that social media contributed to amplify of hate and extremism in Canada. But how can social media be leveraged as a tool to raise awareness, promote education, and counteract hate narrative?
Can you, clarify the question? How can social media use to dispel some of the misinformation that's online? Thank you. I really appreciate that we had two of your colleagues just nodding and saying yes. Thank you. This is a fun group. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. I think there's a lot of information out there. I know the RCMP's got most of their tools and information available on their website, on their external website. I'm not sure why I'm saying there. I'm part of the organization, but we certainly have this available on our website. So certainly putting a lot of tools and information available, certainly leveraging elements like community policing and having those conversations with marginalized groups and vulnerable populations is really, really important to ensure that we're supporting the community and really trying to I'll say bridge those connecting tissues and really be able to dispel some of the myths that perhaps are being purported through misinformation and social media.
And Ms. Madhu, you want to add on? Mr. Madhu, you want to add on that?
Thank you for your question. I actually just aligned with my colleague here. I would say that the service has invested significant resources actually in terms of outreach because we do believe that aside from our investigations, the ability for the service to reach different communities, different levels of government, different associations towards becoming more alive to the threats that are on there will help stitch all the right elements for a better dialogue within society and potentially a way to fight mis and disinformation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that sorry, Pam?
Just a point of order, Chair.
Certainly.
I'm wondering if we can get unanimous consent on something. I don't think there's three more important agencies that the federal government has on this study. And it feels like we've just barely touched the subject. We haven't talked about how we can disrupt the dens that lone wolves live in. We haven't talked about foreign interference. I'm just wondering if we could get unanimous consent for them to return for an hour. I appreciate you gave them extra time, Chair, but I'm just hoping that we can agree to invite them back for another hour.
In addition, for an additional hour part of the committee or the study? I'm seeing majority of the room. Yes? Okay, well, the invitation will go out and we'll have our clerk coordinate with you. Additional point of order?
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge we have Senator Christopher Wells in the room. He's also been invited as a witness to this study. He's let me know that Wednesdays are better for him. He's usually traveling on Mondays, so if the clerk is doing some scheduling,
we will
keep that in mind as well.
Well, welcome, Senator, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony today. At this point, I would also like to encourage you, well, I guess I don't have to encourage you to submit anything that you didn't get an answer provided to because you may be back. At that point, I will be suspending now for approximately 5 minutes. We'll be going to close quickly. Thank you so much.